Thank you all for coming on this moist night. My name is Tony Pizza, and I'm the director of the Ships of the Sea Museum, and on behalf of the staff and the Board of Trustees, I want to welcome you to the Ships of the Sea Museum's new North Garden Assembly Room, and tonight's crosstown presentation of the Beach Institute meets the West Broad Street School of Black Education in Savannah. Kind of sounds like a wrestling match, but there it is. We'll begin with presentations by Dr. Annette K. Brock, who among other endeavors has served as the acting president of Savannah State University and is president and chair of the King-Tisdell Cottage Foundation, which is the parent foundation of the Beach Institute. And also Vaughnette Goode-Walker, who is the project consultant for the King-Tisdell Cottage Foundation and a great friend to the museum. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight two historians with such an encyclopedic knowledge of Savannah history, its African American community, and of particular interest tonight, the issue of black education in Savannah. This is something that we've wanted to do for quite a while, to get the west side and the east side of the town together in terms of education. Tonight also marks the launch of our online West Broad Street School exhibit called A Thirst for Learning, which is on our website, www.shipsofthesea.org. We're also filming tonight's presentation so that it can be added to the online exhibition in the next few weeks, so that we can have everything in the same vessel. We also welcome always any additional information on West Broad Street School. So if you just contact the museum, we'd be happy to interview you and pick your brains. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Annette Brock and Vaughnette Goode-Walker.
And we're bringing out the little guns before the big ones, all right? Good evening, everyone. I'm Vaughnette Goode-Walker, and this is my secret museum. I love the Ships of the Sea, and I'm so delighted to be invited back in February, where every day is Black History Month. And we've been having a great time with the Savannah Black Heritage Festival and all the events that go on around town. So when this invitation came up, why not bring the Beach Institute to the West Broad Street School? I bet they would have done it back in the day when they fought the Husbands. When they've been together? You don't know. You wrote the book, you know. All right. So we have this excitement that is building about these two institutions, because when I first came back to Savannah in 2006, and I would kind of be around town, and people would say to me, well, whatever happened to the West Broad Street School? And then I met Tony Pizza, the director of the Ships of the Sea, and he said, we got to do something to bring back the West Broad Street School, because people recognize this site as that. And he's done a tremendous job. He and Wendy Melton and his staff. I thank Michelle Riley too tonight for pulling this all together. That's why you're all in these seats. Thank you again. And it's just a delight. The other hard part of this, and not very hard, for the last year and a half almost, I've been in the archives of the King-Tisdell Cottage Foundation. And that is the most exciting adventure I've ever had, because there, W.W. Law, who we have been paying tribute to this whole month of February here in Savannah especially, is where he swirled away a lot of Savannah's Black history. And in that history, you just kind of go through it, and you find out, I've seen diplomas from the West Broad Street School of kids who were in the first grade. Pauline Stoney, the Stoney family, some of you may already recognize the name, they donated their documents to the King-Tisdell Cottage Foundation. There's also a postcard when it was the West Broad Street School, when it had that third level on top of the building there. And so that history is alive and well. We also have artifacts that are related to the Beach Institute that, by the way, shameless plug, was opened in 1867 as the first school built for blacks. But I'm getting ahead of my story, because my part of this introductory talk is to connect you with a black education in Savannah. First of all, I start at the beginning. Savannah, as you know, was founded in 1733, and on February 12th, we observe our anniversary of that event with the founding of the colony. By 1755, when slavery had been made legal in the colony 5 years before, in Savannah, it was against the law to teach free blacks or slaves to read and write. But somehow the church would get around this. Somehow the church would encourage this kind of learning within the city of Savannah. And I stopped there, and I definitely have to say, in 1750, not only were there plantations in the east and west of the city where enslaved people were, but there were enslaved people in the city, and this constituted the urban slave population. So I say that at the outset of this talk, because then you will understand that perhaps on those plantations where they were preserving the culture as we have today, the remnants of the Gullah Geechee culture up and down the coast, you also know that here in the city, they would have been assimilating the culture that they were around. And with assimilation comes, obviously, education. Now, as a result of that, at the turn of the century, say 1798, there was an influx of free people of color who would come from Haiti with their masters. One of those families would have been the Monroe family that we hear about, talked about here in the history of the city. And those free people of color were very interested in education. As a result, they created what we call secret schools. And they emerged all around the city. And they were primarily for the urban slave population, and they operated between 1818 and 1860. One of the things you have to remember whenever you're dealing with a history lesson is history and context. When things started out, well, the laws were lax because nobody was really being educated. So as time goes on, you might not want the enslaved people to learn about rebellion, say. So after the Haitian Revolution, that was something that was thought about here in Savannah because they outlawed the Atlantic slave trade in 1798 instead of 1808 when Congress did it. So they didn't want to talk of revolution, let alone reading about it. You had schools that operated here in the city by free blacks: James Porter, Mary Woodhouse, and Jane DeVoe. Now, I isolate those three because at the end I do their educational profile to tell you what happened with them and how this becomes important to the story. Now, the other piece of the story is the Savannah Educational Association. I love that C. And it was organized in January 1865 at the First African Baptist Church, the one right across the street behind us, by the way. This Ships of the Sea Museum is on some pretty sacred ground in between the First Bryant on this end and the First African Baptist on the other side. So it's kind of a great neighborhood to be in. At any rate, the Savannah Educational Association was formed. It was also known as the Cottage Educational Association. It had an executive committee. It included Reverend James Lynch. You might remember his name. He would have been the youngest minister to meet with General Sherman at the Goode-Walker house. And Lynch was the man who said, we're going to go to mountain bikes, as opposed to the other 25 who said, we don't. You also had John Cox. You might recognize his name as one of the pastors of the Baptist Church. James Porter comes straight out of St. Stephen's. We'll talk about him later. He was the secretary. And Ulysses Houston, who was the pastor at the Third African Baptist Church, which eventually would become the First One. He was the treasurer. The C was created to establish schools for the improvement of its people and to raise money to support them. Getting ahead of the story, going back to my story, you know that it was field order number 15 that happened at Green Meldrum House. And part of that was, yes, you get 48 acres of land, but they also wanted education. They wanted places from the Freedmen's Bureau that those newly freed blacks could be educated. So the community support for C was there. Anyone could join the Savannah Educational Association. The dues were $3 a year, which is a lot of money after the war, and 25 cents a month, or one could contribute $10 a year to become a life member. And I thought that the $10 figure was kind of ironic because the $10 figure reminded me of the badges that the urban slaves wore here in the city of Savannah. They paid $10 a year for those badges so that people would know the jobs that they did. Either they paid these urban slaves who were paid for their service or their masters paid it. So now they pay $10 a year to become a life member of the Savannah Education Association. Think about what they were thinking about. Now, C had collected almost $700 in January 1865, making it possible to open 2 outland free schools in Savannah on January 15th. That's amazing. Sherman had only come to town in December. He tied it up in a bow, gave it to Mr. Lincoln, and hey, these guys are going to school. The executive committee of C nominated potential black candidates teaching positions. And that would have been important because we wanted, they wanted to continue the tradition, possibly of those schools, where you would have had, blacks teaching other blacks. Now those Freedmen schools, they're amazing stories. The Bryan Free School still standing today, but not a sign or a reminder of what it is. Approximately 450 students occupy the old Bryan Slave Mart, just west of City Market. It's on the corner of St. Julian and Vaughnette Street, and I think they serve Cafe Gelato there today. The building was previously owned by slave worker Alexander Bryan, who operated a slave mart there in the late 1850s. It had been built by the slave worker John McMorgan. That is part of the story that we tell in Civil War Savannah. Workers, members, and Baleen are the workers who operated in the city of Savannah. So to realize that ultimately this slave mart would become the first free school. And this was what James Lynch wrote back to the Freedmen's Bureau, saying, we really want to use this building. So they hung the sign out, and they said that the young people actually were given the pages that they had written the slave bill of sales on, turned them over and told to write out the backs of it. And every time I say that, I also say, I wish my mom had done that to me after the Civil Rights Movement. I really would. Because there are those of you who are sitting here in front of me tonight who were in that movement. And that's something that really needs to be passed on. That's the movement that a lot of this generation has missed hearing about. I think that's very important. Now, James Porter, he keeps popping up. It seems very important to the story. James Porter had a secret school in his tailor shop, and it was in the same building as the Montmagnon building, or the Bryan Freedmen School, and he ends up becoming the first principal of the Bryan Free School. He had a trap door in his tailor shop. There's a shameless plug for Footprints of Savannah. Right to it. And with the background, the point of this is actually the building. Willie hasn't gone here. There it is, in Ellis Square. Across the square, you see the building on the right. That is the Montmagnon building. It's still standing today. Some of the net proceeds from the books Civil War Savannah 1 and 2 are being set aside to get a marker there. The Georgia Historical Society, we need to know what happened in that building. It has a below-grade holding ground as well. The other school was actually nearby, the Overthorpe Free School. It took over the Stiles House on nearby Farm Street, and the house had been used as a Confederate hospital during the Civil War. Savannah and Louis Vuitton, before the opening of what would become the Harbor State Bank, he was the principal, and he directed 450 students in that school. Actually, and I meant to mention, at the Bryan Free School, there had been a procession. They said the 450 students going from Franklin Square, First African Baptist on Franklin Square, through City Market to go to school in the Bryan Slave Mart that had been there. Now, the other thing, during the first year of C, I mentioned the money that was collected. They spent $900. Remember, they only had about $700 when the year started. Well, they spent about $900, and it was a large sum for those newly freed blacks because while this was important, the other thing I want to mention, they were building too, just before the American Civil War. For example, with the church on Franklin Square, they erected the church there, so they had businesses still going on, so they would have had kind of a close-knit community. And if I haven't said this, in 1860 there were 700 free blacks here in the city of Savannah. 22,000 people, almost 7,000 enslaved people, but 700 free blacks. Probably is what turned Sherman on his ear when he came to town. Now the next thing I want to talk about, the growth in black education after emancipation. After emancipation, many newly freed blacks moved to the city of Savannah. This was the big city. Imagine if you've been out there in the hinterlands and finally you can get, near the water, if you will. It increased the number of students in the schools that were here in the city. These free schools, as you could see, they were packed. Some of them actually went to the Massey School for a few weeks as they were trying to get everyone settled. And you have the documentation of that at Massey. The association, it didn't charge tuition, so that also resulted in the organization's funds being depleted. So C was basically forced to appeal to Northern aid societies for financial help. And one of those that would answer the call would be the American Missionary Association. sign that is now up in Madison Square. Finally, the one about the Green Meldrum House had always been there, but it never mentioned the meeting with the ministers. So this sign does honor that memory and tell you about what Field Order number 15 was all about. And I point to that because of the Freedmen's Bureau and this establishment in March of 1865. They were moving fast. December, January, February, they did the speech over at the Second African Baptist Church where they tell you got this land. Ulysses Houston took about 1,000 blacks over the Skidaway to claim the land there. So the Freedmen's Bureau did a lot of work. Prior to its creation, though, by the federal government, General Sherman and Stanton had met with the black leaders at the Green Meldrum House to determine the Freedmen's most pressing needs. In Savannah, education topped the list. They wanted to train them because remember, those urban slaves, if I hadn't said this, they had skills. In order to work in the city, to be carpenters, they were sawyers. That's my favorite job, the guy who sawed all day. They were coopers, they were draymen, they had horses. They were entrepreneurs. So they knew that education would be the logical order of things. So after the Bureau received federal monies in 1867 to erect buildings, it began to make plans for major cities in Georgia, and that also obviously included Savannah. So this is the next order of progression with the American Missionary Association. In 1867, $10,000 was earmarked, that's a lot of money, by the Freedmen's Bureau for a school in Savannah to be run by the American Missionary Association, the AMA, and plus $3,000 would complete the building of the Youth Institute. By 1870, the Bureau had ceased all educational work in Georgia and had assigned Savannah as AMA territory. And that meant that it provided financial and political support and erected a new school building for their use. Now, I told you I would go to my educational profile because I'm educating you and you're educating me when you ask questions later. So I'm going to talk a little bit about James Porter because he is important to the story. First of all, he was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1826. He was an educator, musician, tailor, politician, fraternal organizer, military officer, preacher, lecturer, linguist, spoke German, French, and Spanish. That's a lot of stuff to do in one lifetime. He came to Savannah in 1854. 1854, that was the beginning of the ramped up third generation slave trade. And he came when Christ Church decided to turn its colored Forest City River mission into a church. He was an organist and choir leader that was needed for the new church, and Porter got a job. His guardian, as was the custom in Savannah, free blacks had to have a guardian to kind of co-sign things like property and the like. And his guardian would be Bishop Stephen Elliott, for whom the new church, St. Stephen's, was eventually named. And James Porter, during the American Civil War, he served in the Union Army as a master sergeant in the Medical Corps. He was one of the founders and first president of the Mutual Benevolent Society in 1875. And I get excited because I read that because I've been reading that history at the Shameless Plug, King-Tisdell Cottage Foundation. Please come and visit us at the King-Tisdell Cottage. But there, the Mutual Benevolent Society's papers are there, and they talk about the founding of this organization. Now, I know my friend sitting right here, y'all know that's the Mutual, right? Everybody Mutuals? Okay, that's different. That came later, that's the party crew. This was the political crew, okay? And the political crew of the Mutual Benevolent Society had been influenced by Aaron Bradley, who was a radical Republican who came to this area. And they needed these societies because, as you know, after the American Civil War, things were totally separate. So they did this, and they formed this nucleus community in the black community during Reconstruction. It would be the same as you find in the Masonic history in this area. And the society at that time promoted political, fraternal, economic, industrial, social, and spiritual progress. So spiritual meant the church was indeed involved. In 1868, James Porter became the first person ever hired by the Savannah Shadow Board of Education to teach blacks, and ultimately became the principal of the West Wall Street School. From 1870 to 72, he served one term in the Georgia House of Representatives, and he and another legislator, black legislator, introduced a bill that would eventually establish a black college in Georgia. And that black college would become Atlanta University, and W. Du Bois, and the rest, as they say, is history. It goes on. From 1876 to 1878, Porter served as U.S. Collector of Customs at the Port of Savannah, and he made an impact. He would eventually leave Savannah. Actually, he became an AME. I'll just say that, and I was proud to be that, because my family were AME ministers, so that was, he jumped ship from the Episcopal Church and comes to AME, and but he's following Henry McNeil Turner. And eventually, when he comes back home to be interred, he's buried over at Largo Cemetery. He's actually buried from St. Philip Monument, the Mother Church of Georgia, where my uncle, the great F.B. Donald, was the pastor. I say that out loud because he was a black Republican, and he doesn't get a lot of help. Happy Black History Month. All right. Okay. We go on with my educational profile, but I had to get that in. All right. Oh, Mary Woodhouse. You've been reading this while I'm talking. Mary Woodhouse was a free woman of color. She operated a secret school in Bay Lane between Haversham and Price Street. She was a member of Christ Church. She was one of the congregants. She owned property with Catherine DeVoe and Warren Ward, and her most notable student, Susie K. Taylor. This gentleman has the reminiscences with him tonight, and Susie K. Taylor talks about the secret school that she would go to with, the Mary Woodhouse School, and they would gather at Warren Square, about 25 or 30 of them every morning, going in for their lessons. And this is my favorite picture of Warren Square. These pictures, by the way, are from the Civil War Savannah, taken by Cindy Wallace. And Warren Square, this is that ghost tour line, has no moss in the trees. Okay, welcome to Savannah. Okay, and the last profile, of course, is Jane DeVoe. Jane DeVoe is an interesting study. She was a free black, free by the birth of her mother, Catherine. Catherine DeVoe married John DeVoe, who started the Savannah Blues. I think it was the sacred band at the Second African Baptist Church in around the 1820s. They were members of the Second African Baptist Church, lived in Green Ward. The house is still there. Jane DeVoe in 1860 had property assessed at $2,000, and that house is still standing today. Her former residence is at the corner of Price and St. Julian Street, and it was moved there by our other great reservationist, Jim Williams, in the 1970s, as he moved houses all around Savannah to make it look like they've always been there. So that's, this is the DeVoe house of Catherine DeVoe that was built in the 1850s, a story and a half. And this is where the secret school would have been conducted. Now, the last one, I had to bring Susie King Taylor into the party because she did a lot with her secret school education. She was born on August 6, 1848, on the Isle of Wight off the seacoast of Georgia. Moved to Savannah at the age of 7 to live with her grandmother, Dolly Reed, a free person of color. Reed was concerned about education as early as the age of 7 for Susie King Taylor, and she sent her to the secret school of Woodhouse. Taylor writes about her experience in reminiscence. Quote, we went every day about 9 o'clock with our books wrapped in paper to prevent police or white persons from seeing them. And that was how they got around it. They thought they were learning the trade, and they kind of were. Susie King Taylor helped eventually to educate Union troops during the war after gaining her freedom in 1862. Because before Field Order Number 15, you look like I made that. If you got down to Fort Pulaski to the Union troops who were there, you could be free. That was Field Order Number 7, and we couldn't read, but we could pick up those oral notes and meanwhile to get out of here. She, after the war, would return to Savannah and open up a school on South Broad Street. South Broad Street is today Overthorpe. And she closed the school in 1867 with the opening of the Beach Institute. And the last photograph here, that would have been the picture of the school, her house on South Broad Street. And the one on the bottom is where the Susie King Taylor house would have been in the lane on Bay between Haversham and Price. And now, for the rest of the story, and I'll come back when she's done, I'd like to introduce Dr. Annette, the chairman of the King-Tisdell Cottage Foundation.
I'm going to talk about the Beach Institute, and I want to thank my co-presenter, Vaughnette Goode-Walker, who I guess intuitively knew that I really hadn't retired. I thought I had. Beach Institute was the first school built in Savannah for blacks. I'd like for you to consider slavery. I'd like for you to consider the war that ended slavery, the Civil War. I'd like for you to consider the forces opposed to slavery, the anti-slavery and abolitionist societies. And I'd like for you to consider the longing and the yearning of the slaves and freed persons of color, free blacks. And when you consider all of those things, you have the antecedents of the historic Beach Institute established 1867. One thing we know about African Americans in Savannah or all over after the war, that is that they were thirsty for learning, and they thought education would be the panacea that would serve as the key to equality. We also know that the thrust for educating blacks would come from northern philanthropic societies, not local or state governments, who were really focusing on a statewide system of education for the first time and directed action toward white youth. We also know that in Savannah, as well as in other communities in the South, African Americans were already active in the process of providing education and were joined in an economic affiliation with the Freedmen's Bureau and the philanthropic groups. The American Missionary Association was incorporated in 1849. It was created as a result of the perceived failure of two abolitionist societies, the Union Missionary Society, which grew out of the Amistad case of 1839 and had been established in 1841, and the Western Reserve Congregational Association, which was organized in 1843 and was concerned chiefly with Indians. It was the collapse of these two that the American Missionary Association developed. The American Missionary Association's goal was to labor to bring abolition through peaceful means, to live up to the principles in the Declaration of Independence and the teachings of Jesus. In other words, to provide full and equal citizenship to the Negro population. The American Missionary Association did not allow slaveholders, polygamists, or other immoralities, and they held that blacks and whites should be one people. The American Missionary Association was the first group to enter the field of Negro education. It preceded the federal government when it established a school for Negroes at Fortress Monroe, Virginia in 1861. They next were recommended, American Missionary Association, recommended and approved by President Lincoln to teach in Port Royal, South Carolina. But it was Georgia that held the great appeal. The history of Georgia was intriguing to the American Missionary Association and offered the challenge it wanted in establishing freedmen's schools. Georgia, as you know, is the largest of the lower southern states in terms of population, in terms of voters, in terms of slaves, slaveholders, and non-slaveholders. Georgia had a population of 465,698 blacks, of whom 3,500 were free. And this is according to the 1860 census. So when the American Missionary Association came to Georgia, they followed on Sherman's heels. And they were determined to plant themselves firmly in this new field in Georgia because the American Missionary Association was tenacious. They established in Georgia the basis for what became the Atlanta University. Now, the American Missionary Association is going to work in close contact with the Freedmen's Bureau, and that was a bond that was strengthened by hard cash and friendship. And in 1865, when the Freedmen's Bureau bill was passed, this was of great historical significance for blacks. It was to coordinate the many relief programs in operation and to give official backing to the teachers of the benevolent societies who would come to teach, in this case in Georgia. So that by this official legislation, the northern teachers of Negroes in the South had gained the protection of Union guns. The early history of education in Savannah brings these themes of black solidarity and northern benevolence together. The city was ripe, and the American Missionary Association knew that it was going to claim Savannah. Well, as Vaughnette has pointed out, the black leaders had very different plans for their children's schooling. It's an exciting period of history during that time. Savannah had an exceptionally well-developed and cohesive community during the antebellum period. She's mentioned the number of free persons and the number of slaves. I won't repeat. And they had a variety of jobs: artisans, carpenters, blacksmiths, mechanics. And perhaps the most popular of all of the occupations was the black grocer. At any rate, in addition to the variation in the occupations, Savannah had a cosmopolitan atmosphere. It was a port city. And there were a lot of black entrepreneurs, well-defined black leadership class. They were very militant, some of them, such as James Sims, who would later serve in our Reconstruction legislature, James Porter, she's mentioned, Aaron Bradley. Did you mention Aaron Bradley? Yeah, he was really, they said he just used to have harangues. But he, after Sherman's field order had been revoked, he was going around telling African Americans, vote on the block. Don't sign those contracts, the contracts that would move them from being landowners to contract workers. James Lynch, just one little note about James Lynch. He is, as Vaughnette said, was the one person at that meeting with Sherman and Stanton who felt that blacks and whites should live together. Only one there. The rest felt that they wanted to, blacks should live alone and handle their own affairs. But it was James Lynch who, through a white friend, got contact to Secretary of War Stanton to convince Sherman to meet with them at that famous meeting when they articulated their goals. The black community had been organized with James Lynch and others to create the Savannah Educational Association, and I won't repeat this, but they had 2 schools operating when Sherman came in December of 1864. The Lynch and the SEA believed that Georgia blacks should rely on their own race for leadership, politics, religion, education, and everything else. However, to be practical, blacks could not in Savannah as elsewhere achieve any real power in municipal government. They didn't have the financial base to establish a comprehensive system of education, free from white interference. Now, when the American Missionary Association came, they saw all of the activity, all these 500 plus students marching in schools, and they were so excited. They said, this is ours, this is ours. But their euphoria soon faded. Assuming that the freed people would welcome aid from them, they made plans to incorporate white teachers into the all-black SEA. they were startled to learn that blacks opposed this effort. The blacks had indicated that if white teachers came to Savannah at all, they would serve as assistants to the black instructors. Now, the SCA was willing, however, to accept the financial contributions of the American Missionary Association, but only providing that no strings were attached. To sort of fast forward this went back and forth for almost a couple of years, and finally, in March of 1866, the Savannah Education Association was forced to apply to the American Missionary Association again for financial aid. This time, the American Missionary Association insisted that the AMA would contribute funds only if they played a major role in deciding how the money would be spent. Well, the SEA, Savannah Education Association, facing compromise or defeat, accepted. So in April, the AMA announced that they planned to employ all of the 12 black teachers as assistants, and that the field was now virtually theirs. The AMA was here. In another year, he said they would have a school building, and of course this was made true by the bequest of the $12,000 that was made by Alfred Ely Beach, editor of Scientific American, and the money that had been given to the Freedmen's Bureau by him and then was turned over to the AMA for the building of the school, which occurred and the school was able to open in 1867. The Freedmen's Bureau after the Freedmen's Bureau and the American Missionary Association collaborated, the building was constructed, and the construction was $12,000. And it was located on a site that had once been owned by the Confederate government. It's very interesting when you look at Confederate history, the number of buildings that were used by Confederates that turned out to be schools for African Americans during the Reconstruction period. But this was used as a depot for stores. It was called Sterling. It was 55 feet by 60 with 2 L's in each L shapes at lobby areas, foyers, 10 by 35. Reports are that it was well lighted, neat and substantial. It was an 8-room frame structure, as we like to say it is today, but we know it's a little modified. The first floor contained 4 large rooms with sliding doors and windows. It had high ceilings, standard desks, seats, and blackboards. In the east of the building, there was a house that was donated by the blacks, the SEA, at a cost of $3,000. Now, the school had an elementary and a normal department. And please understand that education was defined in the broadest sense, which meant that all kinds of schooling took place: literacy classes, instruction in skills, moral instruction. And also keep in mind that in the state of Georgia during this period, only 5% of the state's nearly 500,000 newly freed people attended school. And then with very little irregularity. These people needed to learn how to read, how to do newspapers, labor contracts, write letters, and so forth. The supply of teachers would come, but Beach didn't open as a place where teachers were going to graduate the next year and go out and save the world. Courses in mechanics, domestic science, commercial skills, were taught. Now, when the Beach Institute opened, Susie King Taylor had to close. She was forced to close her school. Again, I'm not going to repeat what we've already heard. People came from all sections. The American Missionary Association embraced the rugged life and a chance to perform useful labor on behalf of those whom they felt were degraded by slavery, but certainly because they had been sinned against. So they wanted teachers to come, and many well-to-do teachers came, and that's really what the American Missionary Association wanted. I will tell you that the American Missionary Association kept copious records, but they really liked the well-to-do teachers who would come and pay their own way to teach and didn't want a salary. And there's a long list of people who fell into that category. These people are highly cited by authors and historians like Du Bois and others, and they're praised. I want to fast forward just a little to 1870, because at that point, a Georgia law provided for a state superintendent of education and separate but equal schools for both races, even though no funds were appropriated. However, even though the law was passed in 1870, Savannah in Georgia and Savannah didn't do anything about it until 1872. That's when the amendment went into effect. That really did not impact African American children. But in July, Black leaders did petition the Board of Education to provide that public education. And I will tell you, if you read what's up here, a lot of what we're both saying is in this exhibit. In 1875, the public school system here in Savannah, the board, reached an agreement with the American Missionary Association to lease the Beach Institute as a free grammar school for Black children. This lasted up until 1878. In 1878, the American Missionary Association decided to reclaim Beach Institute from the public school system, and it was listed as a secondary school. And an interesting thing happened. As soon as this intention was made known, the school was burned by an arsonist. Now, interestingly also, the same thing had happened in Macon, Georgia, but beyond Macon. Beach was partially destroyed by fire in 1787. And so the board moved, and I know you've heard this story many times, the board moved the students to what had been the Fairlawn plantation over on East Broad into what on that property was a place for hospital and a residence for the teachers known as the Bowen House. Now, when the building was rebuilt, the American Missionary Association had reclaimed that building, and they got the insurance money back to rebuild the building. Now, Beach continued in operation by the American Missionary Association until 1919, when the American Missionary Association closed all of its high schools. At this time, many of the students went to Savannah State and other places, and at that time, Savannah State had the 3 departments, which included a subnormal, a normal, and the college preparatory. The building, however, was officially turned over to the Congregational Church, but it wasn't until 1922 that the Congregational Church reopened the Beach Institute, and it was known as the Beach Continuation School. It had grades 10 through 12 and an enrollment of 82 students. And the first graduating class was in February of 1927. Please note the length of time for graduation. There was a second graduation held in June of the same year. And I want to read you just a few of the people's names because you might recognize some of them. In the 1922 class, pardon me, in the February 1927 class, some of the graduates were James Andrews, Mamie King Felder, I think many of you might remember that name, Robert Gadsden Jr., Alethea Urban, Miss Hamilton, that's our teacher Otis, Magdalene McIver, Kathleen Campbell, Thomas, Wilhelmina Thomas, Bristol Whitehead, Mrs. Maud Patterson, and she became Vaughnette. Mrs. Vaughnette was a dear friend of our favorite teacher, Mrs. Reeves, you might remember. And in the class of June of 1927, you have Arthur Dwight. I know that's a name you're familiar with. Louise King, Daisy Miller, Hazel Jones, and the list goes on and on. I will say that during the period of the Beach, from its inception up until it finally, in 1929, moved into what had already been established as the College Street School, some of the people who graduated from Beach included Robert, well, I said some, but I'm only naming one. Perhaps the most famous graduate of the Beach Institute was Robert Abbott, and you would remember him because he became the owner and publisher of the Chicago Defender. I want you to keep in mind that everything you have to put in a context, there's a perspective. And these were turbulent times. Reconstruction might be considered the best of times, and then it might be considered the worst of times. I mean, there were accomplishments made, education was started. But then on the flip side of that, during the years beginning in 1871, when the Democrats reclaimed the South and the Democrats took over the state government, and interesting how history flips, and you don't know that. Well, anyway, the Democrats and the Republicans, the blacks like Republicans in the 1880s, and the Democrats took over the state government, and blacks descended into almost complete disenfranchisement. In the 1880s, blacks owned less than 2% of Georgia's acreage, less than 2% of Georgia's acreage. And only 7% of blacks in Georgia owned farms. This is interesting. In the 1880s, the 1880 election, statewide election, was the last statewide contest for 80 years in which more than 50% of Georgia's blacks would cast ballots. It wasn't again until 1960 that you had a 50% voting rate of African Americans. And of course, during this time in 1868, the poll tax was being enforced. Now we know, of course, that following Beach's move to the Cottage Street School, the Board of Education had control of the Beach Institute, and it became many things. It became an elementary school. During the interim, before the continuation school started, and certainly today, while we don't teach classes, we like to think of ourselves as still promoting education, advancing education, and providing education through the kinds of programs and services that we offer. We offer lectures, we offer cultural programs. As a matter of fact, the Beach Institute is considered the cultural arm of our foundation. I'd like to thank all of the members of the board and the chair for inviting us this afternoon. I just know you're going to ask some questions, and hopefully Vaughnette is gonna, we'll be happy to answer them. But anyway, this is Beach Institute, and from its historic perspective and a capstone